No one expected the afternoon of public humiliation at the city's most imposing mansion to turn into the moment a man in worn overalls and calloused hands would reveal himself as the true owner of it all. The warm October breeze danced through the meticulously manicured gardens of Arthur Blackwood's estate, carrying the scent of jasmine and the distant echo of elegant conversations. It was one of those golden afternoons that seemed specially ordered for high-class social events, where every detail breathed opulence and each guest flaunted their importance like an invisible medal on their chest. Otis Miller adjusted his faded straw hat and bent down to collect the fallen leaves near the infinity pool. His movements were slow, deliberate, like those of someone who had learned to find rhythm in repetition. His hands, marked by decades of labor, held each leaf with a gentleness that contrasted with the apparent roughness of his appearance. At 62, Otis carried on his stooped shoulders a story few knew. His eyes, a deep brown like freshly plowed earth, had witnessed transformations that would make any novel seem like cheap fiction. But there, at that moment, he was just another invisible worker amidst the spectacle of vanities unfolding around him. Arthur Blackwood's party was in full swing. Influential businessmen circulated through the gardens with champagne flutes, their laughter echoing among the imperial palm trees. Socialites displayed dresses that cost more than a popular car, while journalists specializing in high society gossip waited for the right moment to capture a scandal that would yield sensational headlines. Arthur, a 45-year-old man with an ego inflated by inherited wealth, pontificated at the center of a group of admirers. His theatrical gestures and his affected voice revealed someone accustomed to being the center of attention, the kind of person who confused respect with subservience and admiration with flattery. "You can't imagine the work it takes to maintain a property like this," Arthur boasted, gesturing towards the gardens. "It takes a keen eye for detail, a refined aesthetic sense that, let's face it, isn't for everyone." The guests nodded with calculated smiles, those smiles that say more about interest than genuine agreement. It was a well-rehearsed theater, where each actor knew their role and played it with the precision of someone who depended on that stage to maintain their social position. It was at that moment that Arthur's gaze fell upon Otis, who continued his work with the same tranquility as always. There was something about the gardener's serene posture that deeply irritated Arthur, as if that inner peace were an affront to his constant need for external validation. "Someone get this fellow out of here," Arthur's voice cut through the air like a knife. The silence that followed was one that made time seem suspended. Some guests lowered their eyes, embarrassed. Others, accustomed to Arthur's excesses, limited themselves to restrained smiles, as if they were accomplices to an inside joke. Otis didn't raise his head immediately. His hands continued their motion of collecting leaves, as if Arthur's words were just another background noise. There was a silent dignity in his posture, a resistance that didn't need words to manifest itself. "Are you deaf too?" Arthur insisted, now with a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Must be one of those who is content with little, poor in spirit." The laughter that followed was nervous, uncomfortable. Even the most insensitive among the guests seemed to realize that something was getting out of control. There was an unnecessary cruelty in Arthur's tone, a need to humiliate that revealed more about his own insecurities than about the character of his victim. Otis finally stood up, moving with the same deliberate calm that characterized all his gestures. His eyes met Arthur's, and for a moment it was as if two completely different realities collided in the air. On one side, the arrogance born of privilege. On the other, the serenity forged in adversity. "Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen." Otis's voice was low, but it carried an authority that made everyone present turn to him. There was something in his tone that made Arthur take half a step back. It wasn't a threat, it wasn't a confrontation, it was simply the presence of someone who knew exactly who he was and what his place in the world was. "Misunderstanding." Arthur tried to maintain a mocking tone, but his voice betrayed a note of uncertainty. What misunderstanding? You're nothing but a— I am Otis Miller, the gardener interrupted, his voice gaining a volume that didn't need to be loud to be heard by everyone. The statement fell upon the guests like a silent bomb. Some smiled, thinking it was a tasteless joke. Others frowned, trying to process the information. Arthur forced a laugh, but his eyes revealed a growing confusion. "What nonsense is this?" Arthur tried to regain control of the situation. "Are you hearing this? The gardener has gone mad?" But Otis wasn't finished. His hands, still dirty with earth, reached into the back pocket of his overalls and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, he pulled out an elegant business card, which he extended to Arthur with the same courtesy he would offer a flower. Arthur took the card with trembling fingers and read aloud, his voice losing strength with each word. Otis Miller, owner, Blackwood Manor. He stopped, his face paling. This can't be true." A murmur ran through the crowd like a wave. Cell phones were discreetly raised. Cameras began to capture the moment. The journalist, Mariana Reyes, known for her knack for uncovering scandals, approached with eyes shining with anticipation. "Mr. Miller," she said, her professional voice masking the excitement she felt, "are you saying you own this property?" Otis nodded calmly. "For over 5 years, to be exact. I bought this manor through a middleman, keeping my identity confidential. Mr. Blackwood was my tenant, with a lease that expired 6 months ago." The ensuing silence was deafening. Arthur opened and closed his mouth several times, like a fish out of water. His mind seemed unable to process the information, to accept that his reality had been turned upside down in a matter of minutes. "That's impossible," Arthur mumbled, his voice now almost a whisper. "I'm Arthur Blackwood. I'm well known. I have businesses. Mr. Blackwood," Otis interrupted, gently but firmly. "You have failing businesses and debts that prevent you from renewing any contract. My lawyer tried to contact you several times in the past few months." Then a man in a dark suit emerged from the crowd. Dr. Robert Alvarez, one of the city's most respected lawyers, held a leather briefcase that seemed to contain important documents. Many guests recognized him immediately, and his presence there gave even more credibility to Otis's words. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen." Dr. Alvarez greeted them with the formality of someone accustomed to handling delicate situations. "I can confirm that Mr. Otis Miller is, in fact, the legal owner of this property. I have all the necessary documents here to prove it." He opened the briefcase and pulled out a series of papers, which he began to read aloud. Deeds, contracts, registration certificates, everything was there, in black and white, confirming what seemed impossible. The man who had been humiliated minutes before was the true owner of it all. Arthur stumbled, looking for a chair to support himself. His arrogance had completely dissolved, replaced by a confusion bordering on despair. The guests who moments before had fawned over him now observed him with a mixture of embarrassment and morbid curiosity. But how?" Arthur finally managed to articulate. "How is this possible?" Otis removed his straw hat and ran a hand through his graying hair. It was time to reveal a story he had kept secret for so long, a story that would explain not only his financial situation, but also his choice to live so simply. "Ladies and gentlemen," Otis began, his voice taking on a more personal tone, "may I tell you a story that might help clarify a few things." The guests drew closer, forming a circle around him. Even those who had initially laughed at the situation now seemed genuinely interested in hearing what he had to say. 30 years ago, I was a young engineer fresh out of college, full of dreams and ambitions. I worked for a tech company that, at the time, seemed promising. I developed an agricultural automation system that, today, is used on farms all over the world. Otis paused, his eyes losing themselves in the distance, as if he were seeing scenes from a distant past. "I was married to a wonderful woman, Elena, and we had a daughter, Sophia. We lived in a simple house, but we were happy, very happy. The crowd remained silent, hypnotized by the transformation that was happening before their eyes. The humble gardener was revealing himself as someone with a far more complex story than anyone had imagined. But the success of my invention changed everything, Otis continued, his voice carrying a sadness that even the years hadn't been able to erase. Suddenly, we were rich, very rich, and I made the mistake of thinking that money would make our lives better. He began to walk slowly among the guests, his hands gesturing softly as he spoke. We bought a mansion, even bigger than this one, imported cars, jewelry, trips to exotic places. I became so obsessed with accumulating wealth that I forgot to pay attention to my family. A single tear rolled down Otis's face, but he continued speaking. Elena tried to warn me several times. She said I had changed, that I wasn't the man she had married. But I was blinded by ambition, deaf to the cries for help from the woman I loved most in the world. Otis's words echoed through the garden, creating an atmosphere of intimacy that contrasted sharply with the frivolity of the party that had taken place minutes before. Some guests had tears in their eyes, others lowered their heads, embarrassed. But how? Arthur finally managed to articulate. How is this possible? Otis removed his straw hat and ran a hand through his graying hair. It was time to reveal a story he had kept secret for so long, a story that would explain not only his financial situation, but also his choice to live so simply. "Ladies and gentlemen," Otis began, his voice taking on a more personal tone, "may I tell you a story? A story that might help clarify a few things." The guests drew closer, forming a circle around him. Even those who had initially laughed at the situation now seemed genuinely interested in hearing what he had to say. 30 years ago, I was a young engineer fresh out of college, full of dreams and ambitions. I worked for a tech company that, at the time, seemed promising. I developed an agricultural automation system that, today, is used on farms all over the world. Otis paused, his eyes losing themselves in the distance, as if he were seeing scenes from a distant past. I was married to a wonderful woman, Elena, and we had a daughter, Sophia. We lived in a simple house, but we were happy, very happy. The crowd remained silent, hypnotized by the transformation that was happening before their eyes. The humble gardener was revealing himself as someone with a far more complex story than anyone had imagined. But the success of my invention changed everything, Otis continued, his voice carrying a sadness that even the years hadn't been able to erase. Suddenly, we were rich, very rich, and I made the mistake of thinking that money would make our lives better. He began to walk slowly among the guests, his hands gesturing softly as he spoke. We bought a mansion, even bigger than this one, imported cars, jewelry, trips to exotic places. I became so obsessed with accumulating wealth that I forgot to pay attention to my family. A single tear rolled down Otis's face, but he continued speaking. Elena tried to warn me several times. She said I had changed, that I wasn't the man she had married. But I was blinded by ambition, deaf to the cries for help from the woman I loved most in the world. Otis's words echoed through the garden, creating an atmosphere of intimacy that contrasted sharply with the frivolity of the party that had taken place minutes before. Some guests had tears in their eyes, others lowered their heads, embarrassed. But how? Arthur finally managed to articulate. How is this possible? Otis removed his straw hat and ran a hand through his graying hair. It was time to reveal a story he had kept secret for so long, a story that would explain not only his financial situation, but also his choice to live so simply. "Ladies and gentlemen," Otis began, his voice taking on a more personal tone, "may I tell you a story? A story that might help clarify a few things." The guests drew closer, forming a circle around him. Even those who had initially laughed at the situation now seemed genuinely interested in hearing what he had to say. 30 years ago, I was a young engineer fresh out of college, full of dreams and ambitions. I worked for a tech company that, at the time, seemed promising. I developed an agricultural automation system that, today, is used on farms all over the world. Otis paused, his eyes losing themselves in the distance, as if he were seeing scenes from a distant past. I was married to a wonderful woman, Alina, and we had a daughter, Sophia. We lived in a simple house, but we were happy, very happy. The crowd remained silent, hypnotized by the transformation that was happening before their eyes. The humble gardener was revealing himself as someone with a far more complex story than anyone had imagined. But the success of my invention changed everything, Otis continued, his voice carrying a sadness that even the years hadn't been able to erase. Suddenly, we were rich, very rich, and I made the mistake of thinking that money would make our lives better. He began to walk slowly among the guests, his hands gesturing softly as he spoke. We bought a mansion, even bigger than this one, imported cars, jewelry, trips to exotic places. I became so obsessed with accumulating wealth that I forgot to pay attention to my family. A single tear rolled down Otis's face, but he continued speaking. Elena tried to warn me several times. She said I had changed, that I wasn't the man she had married. But I was blinded by ambition, deaf to the cries for help from the woman I loved most in the world. Otis's words echoed through the garden, creating an atmosphere of intimacy that contrasted sharply with the frivolity of the party that happened minutes before. Some guests had tears in their eyes, others lowered their heads, embarrassed. But how? Arthur finally managed to articulate. How is this possible? Otis removed his straw hat and ran a hand through his graying hair. It was time to reveal a story he had kept secret for so long, a story that would explain not only his financial situation, but also his choice to live so simply. "Ladies and gentlemen," Otis began, his voice taking on a more personal tone, "may I tell you a story? A story that might help clarify a few things." The guests drew closer, forming a circle around him. Even those who had initially laughed at the situation now seemed genuinely interested in hearing what he had to say. 30 years ago, I was a young engineer fresh out of college, full of dreams and ambitions. I worked for a tech company that, at the time, seemed promising. I developed an agricultural automation system that, today, is used on farms all over the world. Otis paused, his eyes losing themselves in the distance, as if he were seeing scenes from a distant past. I was married to a wonderful woman, Elena, and we had a daughter, Sophia. We lived in a simple house, but we were happy. The crowd remained silent, hypnotized by the transformation that was happening before their eyes. The humble gardener was revealing himself as someone with a far more— We're just two men who chose different paths to deal with their insecurities. Otis's words echoed through the garden, creating a moment of reflective silence. Some guests had begun to leave, embarrassed by their own complicity in the initial humiliation. Others remained, clearly touched by the dignity with which Otis had handled the whole situation. Dr. Alvarez discreetly approached Otis. "Mr. Miller, about the legal matter, would you like me to arrange for the formal removal of Mr. Blackwood from the property?" Otis shook his head gently. "No, doctor. I think Mr. Blackwood understands the situation. If he needs a few weeks to find a new place, it's no problem. After all, we all need a little extra time to reorganize ourselves." Arthur looked at Otis with an expression of disbelief. You're giving me time to leave? After everything I said?" "I'm offering you the same thing I wish someone had offered me when I was lost," Otis replied simply. "A second chance to do the right thing." Mariana Reyes, who had discreetly filmed the entire conversation, approached Otis. "Mr. Miller, may I ask some questions for an article? I think this story needs to be told." Otis hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "You can ask, but I ask that you keep the focus on the message, not the sensation." "What's the message?" Mariana asked, her camera still recording. Otis looked around, his eyes passing over each face present. That no one is small because of the clothes they wear or the work they do. Small is someone who elevates themselves by humiliating others. That true wealth is not in what we possess, but in what we are capable of giving. And that it's never too late to start over, to choose to be a better person. He paused, then continued. I bought this property not as an investment, but as a place to reconnect with what really matters. Every morning when I wake up and see the sun rising over these gardens, I remember that I have another day to be useful, to do something that matters. And what matters most to you now? Mariana asked. Otis smiled, his eyes filling with a light that had nothing to do with money or status. It matters that the plants I care for flourish. It matters that the people who work with me feel respected and valued. It matters that when I go to sleep, I can look in the mirror and like the man I see reflected. Arthur, who had remained silent throughout the interview, approached again. Mr. Miller, how can I become a better man? How can I find what you found? Otis put a hand on Arthur's shoulder, a paternal gesture that surprised everyone. Start small, Arthur. Find something you can take care of without expecting anything in return. It could be a plant, an animal, or a person who needs help. Discover the pleasure of giving without calculating the return. But what if I don't know how to do that? Arthur asked, his vulnerability now completely exposed. Nobody knows at the beginning, Otis replied patiently. It took me years to learn. I made mistakes, hurt people I loved, missed opportunities to be happy. These letters became part of his daily routine. Every night, after tending the gardens, he would sit at his simple wooden desk and personally respond to each one. They weren't standardized or formal replies, but genuine messages of encouragement, small seeds of hope that he planted in the hearts of the people who sought him out. Arthur became a regular visitor. Initially, his visits were marked by apologies and expressions of gratitude. But over time, they evolved into deeper conversations about life, purpose, and meaning. Arthur had discovered a passion for working with underprivileged children, and he frequently shared touching stories about the lives he was helping to transform. You know, Otis, Arthur said during one of his visits as he helped water the plants, I used to measure my success by the envy I caused in others. Now, I measure it by the genuine smiles of the children I work with. It's a much better metric. Otis smiled, watching as Arthur's hands, once concerned only with their own appearance, now tended the plants with genuine tenderness. What you've learned, Arthur, is that true happiness doesn't come from being superior to others, but from being useful to them. It was on a December afternoon, almost a year after the incident that had changed their lives, that Otis received a call that surprised him. It was Elena, her voice carrying an urgency he hadn't heard in years. Otis, can you come to the hospital? Sophia, she's had an accident. Otis's world seemed to stop. All his discoveries of inner peace and contentment felt insignificant in the face of potential losing his daughter. He raced to the hospital, his hands still soiled with earth, his heart pounding with a fear he'd forgotten he was capable of. At the hospital, he found Elena in the waiting room, her eyes red from crying. She ran into his arms when she saw him, and for a moment they were just two desperate parents, united by the love they shared for their daughter. What happened? Otis asked, his voice cracking with emotion. Car accident, Elena managed between sobs. She was coming back from the clinic. Someone ran a red light. The doctors say she'll be okay, but Otis, I was so scared of losing her. They embraced in silence, sharing a fear that transcended all past grievances. In that moment, they weren't ex-husband and ex-wife. They were parents, united by the unconditional love they felt for their daughter. Sophia recovered completely, but the scare served as a powerful reminder to all of them about life's fragility and the importance of cherishing every moment.
During the days she was in the hospital, Otis and Elena took turns at her side, caring for her with a dedication that brought back memories of their early years of marriage. "Dad," Sophia said one day, her voice still weak but full of affection, "thank you for being here. Thank you for becoming the man I always wanted you to be." Otis filled his daughter's hand, feeling an overwhelming gratitude for the second chance life had given him. "Thank you for forgiving me, my daughter. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be the father you deserved from the beginning." The accident, ironically, brought the family even closer. Elena started visiting the property regularly, not as an ex-wife, but as a dear friend and the mother of his daughter. After her recovery, Sophia began organizing regular visits with the community children so they could learn about gardening and sustainability. It was during one of these visits that Otis had one of the most rewarding experiences of his new life. An 8-year-old girl, shy and withdrawn, approached him while he was teaching the children about the plant growth cycle. "Mr. Otis," she said in an almost inaudible voice, "can my plant grow even if it starts tiny?" Otis knelt down to her level, their eyes meeting. "Of course it can, sweetheart."
In fact, the plants that start small often become the strongest and most beautiful of all. Even if it starts in a bad place, the girl insisted, and Otis realized she wasn't just talking about plants. Especially if it starts in a bad place, he replied gently, because then it learns to appreciate every drop of water, every ray of sunshine, every moment of care. It becomes strong because it had to fight to grow. The girl smiled for the first time since arriving, and Otis felt his heart warm with a happiness that no financial achievement had ever given him. Months later, he learned from Sophia that the girl came from a troubled family, but had started showing signs of improvement after that conversation. She had even started a small garden in her backyard, tending to some seedlings Otis had given her. This experience crystallized for Otis the true purpose of his journey. He hadn't become a gardener just to find personal peace. He had become a gardener to learn how to cultivate hope in people's hearts, to plant seeds of transformation that would bloom far beyond his own existence. On the second anniversary of the incident that had changed his life, Otis organized a small celebration in the gardens. He invited all the people who had been part of his journey: Arthur, who now ran a community center for at-risk youth; Elena and Sophia, who had become his partners in various social projects; Dr. Alvarez, who had become a dear friend; Mariana Reyes, who had continued to follow his story and become an advocate for social causes. But the most special guests were the dozens of ordinary people who had been touched by his story in some way. Children who had learned about gardening, adults who had found inspiration to change their lives, families who had reconciled after years of estrangement. "Friends," Otis said, standing in the center of the garden that had become a symbol of transformation. "2 years ago, I was a lost man, pretending to be someone I wasn't, measuring my worth by the envy of others. Today, I am exactly who I always wanted to be, someone who cultivates life, who plants hope, who reaps gratitude." He looked around at all the faces present, each representing a story of growth and transformation. But the most important lesson I learned wasn't about gardening. It was about humanity. I learned that we are all seeds with infinite potential. Some of us just need water and sun to bloom. Others need storms to break hard shells that prevent them from growing. Alea, who stood beside Sophia, wiped a tear from her face. Arthur, holding the hand of one of the children from the community center, nodded understandingly. Mariana, who had become a documentarian of inspiring stories, discreetly filmed the moment. "What I would like to leave you with today," Otis continued, "is not my story, but an invitation. An invitation for each of you to find your own garden to cultivate. It doesn't have to be a literal garden. It could be a family, a community, a cause, a dream. The important thing is to find something you can nurture with love, patience, and dedication." He paused, observing how his words were received by those present. Because in the end, when our earthly journey comes to an end, we won't be remembered for what we accumulated, but for what we cultivated. Not for what we took from the world, but for what we gave to it. The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold that were reflected in the petals of the surrounding flowers. It was the end of another day, but Otis knew it was also the beginning of something new for each person present. He had planted seeds in those hearts, and now it was up to each one to decide how to care for them. When all the guests departed, Otis found himself alone in the gardens once more. But this time the solitude wasn't empty. It was a rich solitude, full of happy memories, meaningful connections, a sense of purpose fulfilled. He walked to his favorite bench and sat down, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. He thought about his journey, from blind ambition to genuine humility, from toxic arrogance to serene wisdom, from self-centered isolation to loving connection with the world around him. His phone vibrated gently. It was a message from the shy girl who had visited the gardens months before. "Mr. Miller, my little plant grew, and so did I. Thank you for teaching me that even small seeds can become something beautiful." Otis smiled, feeling his heart filled with a deep and lasting gratitude. He had found his purpose, to be a gardener of souls, someone who helped other people discover and cultivate the best in themselves. That night, as the full moon illuminated the gardens with its silvery light, Otis Miller fell asleep on the bench where he spent his nights, surrounded by the flowers he had planted and cared for with so much love. He dreamed of endless gardens, where each person he had touched blossomed in their own unique beauty, creating a world more beautiful, kinder, and full of hope. And so, the man who had started as a humble gardener revealed himself as not just a wealthy landowner, but as something far more valuable. A cultivator of transformations, a planter of hope, a gardener of the human soul. His greatest wealth wasn't in his bank account, but in the hearts he had touched, the lives he had changed, the love he had cultivated in a world that will always need more gardeners like him.